I've often told my colleagues when you're speaking to people, always remember you're not answering a question, you're answering a questioner. Always remember that. You're not merely answering a question, you're answering a questioner. Behind the question is a person who has brought with himself or herself a cumulative experience, often with value-laden and hurt-laden struggles behind it. Many years ago, as I would read some of my favorite authors, one of them was James Stewart of Scotland. And he, in one of his books, The Strong Name, makes this comment about Jesus. He was the meekest and lowliest of all the sons of men, yet he spoke of coming on the clouds of heaven with the glory of God. He was so austere that evil spirits and demons cried out at his presence, and yet the little children loved to play with him and nestled in his arms. His presence at the innocent gaiety of a village wedding was like the presence of sunshine. No one was half so kind or compassionate to sinners, yet no one ever spoke such red-hot scorching words about sin. A bruised reed he would not break. His whole life was love. Yet on one occasion he demanded of the Pharisees how they ever expected to escape the damnation of hell. He was a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions, yet for sheer stark reality, he has all of the self-styled realists soundly beaten. He was the servant of all, washing the disciples' feet, yet masterfully strode into the temple, and the hucksters and money changers fell over one another as they saw the fire blazing in his eyes. He saved others, yet at the end himself he did not save. Now listen to this line. There is nothing in history like the union of contrasts which confronts us in the Gospels. The mystery of Jesus, says Stewart, is the mystery of divine personality. He starts off by talking about a startling coalescence of contrarieties. A startling coalescence. Not a disparate idea, but a startling coalescence of contrarieties. And in the end, he says, there's nothing like this in history that sees the person of God in such stark contrast. There's a difference between a contradiction and a contrariety. Remember that. A contradiction is where there are two mutually exclusive absolutes being affirmed at the same time and in the same sense. But a contrariety is that which pulls together the two polarities of the same truth. We deal with this all the time. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Freedom gives you liberty. Holiness gives you constraint. So when we talk about may the land be bright with freedom's holy light, isn't America's entire experiment an attempt to reconcile liberty with law? And we struggle with it. We struggle with the idea of the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of the human being. We struggle with the idea of justice and mercy. So the songwriter says, there's a kindness in God's mercy which is more than liberty. And there's that strength in his justice which calls you and me to task. So whether it's liberty or holiness at the same time, whether it's justice and mercy, we must come to terms with the contrarieties that we see in the person of Jesus Christ. If we don't see that, we are bound to be disappointed in the sum and substance of his message. Let me take you through three of these contrarieties with which people struggle, and then see why it is that we end up wondering if the Christian faith has disappointed us. The first is this: it is a life of meaning, but not without tears. It is a life that Jesus offers that's meaningful, but he never ever promises to us that it'll be a life free from tears. In fact, I find one of the most profound moments in Holy Writ when Jesus himself, knowing he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, wept by the grave for his friend. Because he knew this is exactly what you and I would live with. Knowing he would raise him up, he wept. And he shed those tears of loss, knowing this family would sooner or later feel the loss of their brother Lazarus, and one by one we will all be called to that moment. You know, life is often defined by people in sheerly material terms. I will plunder you as long as I can. I will indulge in rapacious act of your lives, your homes, your economy, and so on. And if I have to go, I have to go. How is life ultimately defined by these people? What does Richard Dawkins define as the essential value of life? He totally disregards the fact of evil. The fact of evil. How does he define it? You know, I've often been asked the question on the problem of evil. How can a good God allow so much of suffering and evil in this world? And when we talk about evil, we assume good. When we talk about good, we assume a moral law. When we talk about a moral law, we assume that there's a moral lawgiver. You say, why do you have to assume that? Why do you have to assume a moral lawgiver? Why can't you just stop from evil to good and good to moral law? Can you not just put the parenthesis there and stop? No, because every time the problem of evil is actually raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person, which means it attributes intrinsic worth to personhood. The intrinsic value of personhood is indispensable to the validity of the question, and naturalism cannot give you that bequest. We weep. It is a life of meaning, but not without tears. What then is the struggle in this meaning? One of the greatest Platonist philosophers, Elmer Moore, wrote this in a concluding paragraph in one of his books. Here's what he said: "My longing is for some audible voice out of the infinite silence. My longing is for some audible voice out of the infinite silence, and it rose to a pitch within me of torture, this longing. To be satisfied, I must see face to face. I must, as it were, handle and feel. And how can this be?" So this longing is so agonizing that I really want ultimately to be face to face. I need to be able to touch and feel. It's the way we are wired. It's the way we are made. And so I say to you that we have this longing, we long for meaning. And one of the poets, John Gillespie, wrote this when he had a World War II pilot. "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings, and I've put my hand out and I have touched the face of God." How is that? How is that? When you talk about touching the face of God, when you talk about longing for that feeling, when you talk about longing for that reality of confrontation one-on-one, knowing that God's presence is indisputable, you're not just dealing with a theoretical idea here. I've often said this: the Hebrews, their ultimate was in light. For the Greeks, it was knowledge. For the Romans, it was glory. For the Hebrews, it was light. For the Greeks, it was knowledge. For the Romans, it was glory. The Apostle Paul, who was a Hebrew by birth, who'd studied in a Greek city and was a citizen of Rome, he says this to the church at Corinth: "God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, has caused his light to shine in our hearts, to give to us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus our Lord." So much of our Christian gospel is tied up in words, and so little of it is often stressed on how important that moment of encounter is with Jesus Christ in your own soul and in your own innermost being. I've studied philosophy, I've taught philosophy, I've done apologetics, but even when all of the arguments fade away into the distance, I'll tell you what I will never forget. I'll never forget at the age of 17, in a hospital room in Delhi, having given up all hope and never having cracked open a Bible to read it for myself, when a man walked into the room and brought me this little red New Testament. And my mother there read it out to me, And I cried out and I said, Jesus, I don't know much about you, but if you are who you claim to be, the author of life, I want to receive you into my life, into my heart. I want to follow you. I don't know much about you, but if you are who you claim to be, please take me out of this hospital bed, and I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth. That is my commitment to you. I was 17 years old then. It transformed everything in my life, everything. There's a man in the audience here whom I happened to meet just a month ago. He's a businessman. He and his wife and his two parents drove to Toronto where I was speaking. He was a man from a Hindu background who found Christ a year ago, totally transformed his life. He brought his parents from Ottawa, and he and his wife drove from Cleveland. He's here tonight to meet up with us again. This man in his 40s. And his mother was in her 60s and came to the back room. And as we stood there and talked, she had all her questions from the study of her scriptures and so on. And then that moment came when she recognized the need to trust in Christ for herself. I tell you, in his presence here, he put his head on my shoulder and wept as his mother had the tears running down her face and just praying that prayer to trust in Christ, to see this family totally enveloped with the transforming power of Christ. And then he goes back, and the parents go back to Ottawa. He and his wife go back to Cleveland, and he writes to me the next day, my mother said to me this in her entire life, this is the first night she'd had a totally peaceful sleep in her life. Totally peaceful rest and sleep in her life. I saw a man in China who looked at me and told me he hated Christians, didn't want to believe any of this stuff. By the end of 1 week, after sitting and listening, he came to me and said, you know, my country needs exactly what you've given here. I'm willing to invest any amount of money you ask to do, and I'll pour in a lot of it, bring your message to China. This is what my country needs. You see, it's a life that desperately searches meaning, but is not without tears. And the only way I know you begin is not with argument, it's with that relationship and with that presence that carries you through the tears. Secondly, it's a life of perfection that reaches out to the flawed, and we need to understand this. God is perfect, we are imperfect, and we are flawed. And many times, I say this very cautiously now, we see people who come into our churches and they make a big blunder in their private life. They flounder, they falter, they slip, and they stumble. And you know what? We never let them forget it. We never let them forget it. We interviewed people on the street before we addressed this subject. And when we took the roving cameras, the microphone through many parts of the southern United States, one woman said this from another part of the state. She said, from another state, she said, you know, I used to go to church. I used to believe all this. She said, I unfortunately slipped and had a momentary affair that completely destroyed my own life and my relationship. And she said, I tried to crawl my way back to God and back into life so that I could rebuild it. She said, but I was never able to attend any service without feeling that sense of condemnation and the harshness that I had failed and I'd betrayed, I'd done all this stuff. I could never be at peace again, and therefore I just stopped going. I'm not saying we extend a kind of all embrace that it doesn't really matter, not at all. C.S. Lewis said, I'm hardest on myself for my own private life, but I've learned to be much patient with other people in their private lives and recognize that the hand of grace and the arms of grace need to be reaching out to people across the distances. In my own life, yes, you be tough and be stringent and be careful what you do, but I have to realize that the arms of God reach out, and He's a perfect being who is reaching out to the flawed. The uniqueness of the prodigal son's story is that as that young boy comes running home, it's not so much that he's come to the end of himself and he's coming home. Anybody here from the East, I ask you this, which of you knows a father in the East who would have left the home and gone running to meet the son because the son had already insulted him a long time before and said, give me my right, I'm walking out of you. That father who left the comfort of his room, knowing the son was on his way, and ran halfway to meet him, shows you the grace and the love and the tenderness of God, meeting you even before you were all the way home because of his love and his embrace for you. That's the mercy. That's the grace of God. This is the unique aspect of the Christian faith. I dare you to show me any other worldview. Any other worldview that does not lean on your works. It's not true in Islam. Your good deeds are going to outweigh your bad deeds if you have to enter paradise. Not true in pantheistic worldviews. The law of karma, every birth is a rebirth, and you pay in each life for the previous life. The Bible tells you and me, my grace is sufficient for thee. It's a life of perfection, reaching out to the flawed. And I think we need to be more gentle and more tolerant of the weaker brother who's floundered and fallen and failed. Until then, such people will never really come back to hear the message. I had a woman once contact me, and she was shattered with the way her daughter's life had gone, completely shattered. She wept and wept. I won't go into what had happened. And she said, I just don't even want to go for this wedding. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be seeing what it is that's happening. She said, Ravi, what do you say? I said, ma'am, you're hurting. I just want to say to you this. If you take your voice out of her life, all you are doing is leaving her within the reach of contrary voices, and your voice will never be heard anymore, except as a voice of rejection. It's hard. It's hard. You and I are flawed. We've stumbled. We find ourselves floundering sometimes. But I want you to know God is a God of grace who reaches out, and we had better be patient also. And number 3, a life of harsh physicality, but the triumph is that of the Spirit. It's a life of harsh physicality, but the triumph is that of the Spirit. What do I mean by that? Every temptation you and I face up to somehow is within this physical frame. Every temptation. And you begin to feel it. You begin to feel it. It's the way life actually goes, the physicality. Does temptation go? No. Does temptation go? No. Lust, greed, pride. These are the 3 things you and I battle. I want to tie this together in a way that I think is going to be very important for you and for me. C.S. Lewis, in his book Perelandra, makes this incredible comment. And I think it's fascinating about this good, respectable man one day confronted by an unknown presence with an aura of holiness. Listen very carefully. I felt sure that the creature was what we call good, but I wasn't sure whether I really liked goodness so much as I had supposed. This is a very terrible experience. As long as what you're afraid of is something evil, you may still hope that the good may come to your rescue. But suppose you struggle through to the good and find that that is also so dreadful. How if food itself turns out to be the very thing you can't eat, and the home the very place you can't live, and your very comfort of the person who makes you uncomfortable? Then indeed there is no rescue possible. The last card has been played. For a second or two, I was nearly in that condition. Here at last was a bit of that world from beyond the world, which I had always supposed that I loved and desired, breaking through and appearing to my senses. And I didn't like it. I wanted it to go away. I wanted every possible distance, gulf, curtain, blanket, and barrier to be placed between it and me. You know, he said, it is quite possible that we will never hear the gospel until we have actually first been made uneasy by it. Goodness can discomfort you. We will never really hear the gospel until you are first made uneasy by it. Michael ended on 2 notes. I want to end on the identical notes, coming to it from a different angle. You know, we think sometimes Our belief in God has left us disappointed, and we just not thought what it was going to be. Do you know who the loneliest people in the world are? The loneliest people in the world are not those who become weary of pain, but are those who become weary of pleasure. That is the ultimate form of disappointment. When pleasure has nothing left to give to you and to me. We've tried it all, indulged and indulged and indulged. I have talked to people in that very situation. It is the most pitiable condition to be in. Nothing to look forward to for excitement. Such a man was Oscar Wilde. In his 40s, dying in Paris. I visited the hotel. I visited the place where his funeral was held. Ironically, there was no music in his funeral at all. And Oscar Wilde is lying on his bed, and he looks at his lover, Robbie Ross, and he says this to him. He said, "Robbie, did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake? Did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake?" He says, "No." He says, "Robbie, neither did I. Neither did I." Can I ask you why a hedonist is suddenly thinking of loving for somebody else's own sake? He says, "Bring me a priest." He says, "Only the blood of Christ is big enough now to cleanse this heart of mine." And if you haven't read his Ballad of Reading Gaol, read it. It's the most brilliant piece of poetry where he talks about how the woman with the alabaster ointment is the only one that could express to him what lostness really meant. And here Wilde gives me a hint. Do you know what that hint is? The ultimate fulfillment in life comes from learning to worship God in spirit and in truth, and learning to live within these contrarieties, because he loves you for your own sake, just as you serve him for the essence of who he really is. And I close with this. I was in Damascus, Syria, talking to a Muslim cleric. He was the head of the Shiites, Sheikh Hussein. We had about a 3-hour dialogue. I would ask him one question, he would answer it. He would ask me one question, I would answer it. An audience in front. Sitting between us was the interpreter. He was a fine man, a real gentleman. And finally, at the end, he leaned over after I'd shared the story of the gospel and what it meant. And he says to me, "Professor Zacharias," he said, "maybe it's time for us in the Islamic world." This is a Shiite cleric saying it to me, and I quote him, Sheikh Hussein from Damascus. "Maybe it's time for us in the Islamic world to stop asking the question, if Jesus Christ died, and to start asking the question, why?" Ladies and gentlemen, with all of the contrarieties we see, nothing is a greater contrariety than the cross of Jesus Christ. Showing his love, taking your pain. And with these tensions that we see within the Christian faith, understand the gospel and what it means. Know his presence in your life personally as he calls us to do. And recognize that at the heart of the gospel is the cross. And without that, there is no answer. Both pain and pleasure will disappoint you. That's why the songwriter says, "What language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend? For this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee." There's a wideness in God's mercy which is wider than the sea. There's a kindness in God's justice which is more than liberty. That justice and liberty came together on the cross, and God gives you that same imperative as to how to live it out. For I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. That's the heart of the gospel and transformation. God bless. And see how he processed it, because there's a lot more in here than comes to our mind immediately once you start reading this. I mean, it's a densely textured book. There are so many questions that arise even right from the introduction. What is God really saying here? What is happening behind the scenes? But we know the basic drama of this. Job has lost all of his possessions, he's lost his family, and finally he has lost his own physical well-being. He is covered from head to toe with sores, and he is about to talk to God, and his wife comes and gives him some advice in chapter 2 and verse 9. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. At this point, he's literally holding on to the slender thread of a totally sovereign God. But what he is agonized with is his theological assumptions. Be good and be blessed. Be bad and be cursed. Be good and be blessed. Be bad and be cursed. He says, all right, God is sovereign. I've received all of this. What I want to know is, why am I receiving it? If I have done wrong, explain it to me, please. David Hume put it in these words: were a stranger to suddenly drop into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with an ultimate purpose of love. That last line is almost a metaphysical giveaway. I'm not quite sure if Hume really had thought through that very statement, because even love needs an ontic referent. It needs some objective definition. And in the naturalistic framework, how do you even assume that love can have a point of reference objectively? But so goes Hume, and he says, I would show a stranger all that's around us. How can there be ultimately a purpose of love? I think it was Camus who said this. It is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God. It is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos. It is the feeling that there is something demonic in the heart of things which is working against us, that there is a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe which will ultimately defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose, look at the world, that settles it. So what are the two notions they have introduced in their last line? For Hume, it is love. For Camus, as an existential thinker, he's looking for purpose, meaning. And that's really what it is all about, trying to make sense out of it all. One philosopher puts it as a trilemma for Christians and considers it an evidential argument against the existence of God. Not just a question to defend theism, but he says the reality of evil provides evidence against the existence of God. How so? With the trilemma. Christians say God is all-powerful. Christians say God is all-loving, and yet sin exists. That's the trilemma. An all-powerful God, an all-loving God, the reality of evil. And of course, my immediate response when I read that, I think it is Mackey who produces that, I say to him, why have you just taken three assumptions of the Christian faith? Why is it not a quadlemma? Why is it not a quintilemma? A quadlemma could say God is also all-wise. Does not the wisdom of God bring in a completely different component to the paradigmatic problem? And God, the fifth one, God lives in eternity. Does not time play a factor here in understanding pain and suffering? If you take a child, just about a year old, and you take that child to the doctor and he's about to get jabbed with big needles, my mother is all loving. My mother has the power to either take me into this building or take me out of this building. Why on earth has she taken me into the building where this man is going to jab and hurt me? It takes a few years for the child to find out, now I know. I've come here from Ottawa, Canada, where I spoke at the 50th anniversary of the Canadian Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, and a fantastic gathering. 50 years it's been going. And the night before at the dinner, Dr. Kent Brantley spoke. Some of you may know his name, the doctor who contracted Ebola when he was in Africa. It has been seldom that I've heard such a riveting testimony of the power of God in the life of a totally committed man who understood his calling. He's a physician, and there in just somber tones, yet plain speaking language, told of the horror that struck his body. And as he described it, and all that had to be done to him to put him into that protective suit and fly him out from there and bring him to Emory, and all that went on to ultimately rid him of that dreaded disease that would have taken his life. What if he were a child and you had to explain all that you were doing to that child? Time becomes a component. Understanding becomes a component. To say there's a trilemma is actually trivializing the problem. It is much more complex than just 3 propositions from the Christian faith. But here it is. Job struggles, and he begins to complain. And the biggest problem he had right in the beginning was his friends. I would never dream of giving my son the name Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar. They simply don't look good. And the best thing they did was when they sat silent for a few days, just sitting by his bed. The problem began when they opened their mouths. There's a lot going on here. And that's why he even comments on what kind of miserable comforters are you? You boys are supposed to be my friends. Friends should at least try to defang the pain in some way. So the first one, Eliphaz, the oldest, begins with an incredible story. I don't know which church he went to, but he begins by this. He says, "A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my face stood up." As soon as he would have begun like that, if I was sitting on an ash pile, I'll say, "Please, Lord, help me. Where is this boy going?" A spirit glided past my face, the hair of my face stood up, and it stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes, there was silence, and then I heard a voice, "Can mortal man be righteous before God? Can a man be pure before his maker?" All right, here's Job. You're sitting head to toe with boils, and I come to you and say, "I want to tell you something. A spirit glided past my face. The hair on my body just stood up, There was silence, and he probably saying, I wish you'd do the same. And then, then the Spirit spoke, "Can a man be pure before his maker? Can a man be righteous before God?" Even if it were true, there's a problem here. I remember my professor of the history of Christian thought in my graduate school days. Some of you may know the name, but he had 7 earned degrees. 3 of them were doctorates. Dr. Montgomery. We used to pray before we went to class because he used to give half of the grade for the questions we asked in class. And we'd sit up half the night thinking up of questions. And then he gave us the exam, and I had a problem. I didn't understand a single of his question. And I kept looking at this saying, what am I going to do? I don't even know what he's asking me for. But the bothersome thing was the guy in the next desk was writing away furiously, hardly breathing between sentences and going on and on and on and on. I said, what's the matter? He's writing, taking more sheets, ripping more sheets, filling out. I've yet to comprehend what he's asking me to write about. So on the day when we got our marks back, I wanted to see what he got. And when Dr. Montgomery handed it back, he looked at his sheet of paper. In India, when we grew up and we didn't know the answer to something, we'd write as much as we think was possibly remotely connected to the subject. And in the volume of words would be some hint in the direction. We used to call it padding, just pad, just say all that you think needs to be said, and somewhere you may say what the professor wants to see. Well, he padded it. And Dr. Montgomery, just in red ink, wrote this one line: "This is not right. this is not even wrong. You see, if you say something is right, you're assuming something's been said. If you say something is wrong, again, you're assuming something's been said. When it does not even rise to the dignity of an error, that's when you say, this is not even wrong. What do you say to a man like Eliphaz? So Job just comes back and he says this, you know what? A despairing man should have the devotion of his friends. Please don't leave me to suffer like this. And then he says, your speeches are heartless. You would even cast lots upon orphans. All right, if I have sinned, tell me why I'm not being pardoned. I won't argue against it. Why am I being punished? Then he comes out with this line, teach me, and I will hold my peace. Lead me to understand. So Eliphaz is done with his speech. And then comes Bildad. He's a little more cruel. He calls Job a windbag. And then he says, inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and apply myself to that which the fathers have searched out. They shall utter words out of the past. Again, it's good counsel, but it's simply not getting to where Job's at. Inquire of the past. Augustine has written on these issues. Luther has written on these issues. So many great thinkers have written on these issues. Inquire of them what it is they really said. Yes, it helps. One of my professors at Trinity was a man by the name of Feinberg, Dr. Feinberg. His master's thesis, his doctoral dissertation was on the problem of evil and the problem of pain. I quoted him in my book. I had no idea what he, following all of that, went through with his family as his wife contracted a most dreaded disease in which gradually you lose all capacity. And then to their horror, they find out that it is passed on from generation to generation. And he became terrified about what his children would face. And Dr. Feinberg said, with all of my reading and all of my knowledge and all of my breadth of understanding, when this news came to me, I was floored. I didn't know where to go with it. And that's the reality. You understand that. I understand that. I've been through some of it myself, and every time it happens, I say, this is hard, Lord. I don't know how I'm going to climb this hill. You understand what's going on? I don't. And so, as Bildad says, inquire of the former age, Job's response is this. Look, is his power arbitrary? Does he really, at whim, inflict this stuff? He says, I don't doubt God's existence. I'm just wondering about his purpose. And then he says, how can I be just before God? He says, why doesn't he just leave me alone? Not bother with me. Why this? And then he comes out with this. Is there an umpire between God and me? Somebody who can plead my cause before him. And so Eliphaz's speech ends with Job asking for understanding. Now he's coming a little more to a point. He says, I want to know if there's somebody who can stand before God on my behalf and plead my case. Now comes Zophar, the youngest, and he's the rudest. And he goes on to say, you know what, Job? We've really got a problem. It is easier for a donkey to learn wisdom than for us to teach you, an idiot. How do we teach you? How are we going to get through to you? And then he says, don't you understand, Job? Your ways are not God's ways. His ways are not yours. Again, it's true. We know that. God's ways are not our ways. Job is just trying to wrestle with purpose, trying to wrestle with representation. And now he comes to a series of questions and he says this, talk to me, God. What have I done? Is there a clue? And then he comes
with this statement to his friends, when you boys die, wisdom is going to die with you. You see what's happened? Those who came to help have suddenly become his tormentors because they are missing something very important. I've learned in years of visiting places where an awful lot of pain is being experienced. You're better off remaining silent and just shedding your tears with that individual than saying something that is going to just hurt even more. In the book, I give this illustration. I've had 2 major back surgeries. If any one of you has lived with major back issues, you know the kind of pain you can have. And there were days where even after my surgery, I'd be sitting in my car, going to meet my wife or children for dinner, and I'd be sitting there in a parking spot and lean on the steering wheel and just cry. The pain was so agonizing. I have 2 titanium rods from L3 to S1, 4 clamps, 8 screws bolting me down. I injured it very badly many, many years ago, and all those years went by with a lot of pain. And as I have struggled with that, I've just found out that sometimes all you really need is a helping arm around your shoulder or something during those days. But here's what I want to tell you. I tell this story in my book. After my back surgery, it's a heavy padding they put on there, and I couldn't move. For about 4 days, I couldn't move. Actually, that was the second one because the dura, the lining, tore, and trying to mend that was a challenge. And he said, for 4 days, you can't move. You have to lie totally motionless. He says, if you need to turn, we'll send a couple of nurses, and they will try to turn you together. So I went and lay down, and about 2 days go by, and I say, I wish I could just lie on my back for a minute or two, So I called an orderly. He brought another man, and they very skillfully, with a sheet under them, they turned me to my side, all for about 2-3 minutes, and then I had to come back. Middle of the night, I said, I just have to turn. So I called the nurse, and she said, all right, I'll try and turn you. I said, ma'am, it took 2 pretty tough guys to do it in the afternoon. Can you bring another nurse to help you? You're going to need 2. I don't think you can do it all by yourself. She said, no, I'm very experienced. I said, the way they did it, it needed 2 of them to hold a sheet, She said, you know what? I've been a nurse long enough, so I wasn't going to argue. She rammed her hands underneath my back. I will not tell you the thoughts in my mind, but I will tell you that I screamed. And you know what she said? You've had back surgery. I thought you'd come for a hip replacement. I couldn't believe this. The next day when I told the doctor that, I won't tell you what he said. He stormed out of that room because that place could not be touched. You touch a healing wound in a wrong way, you will do greater damage than any intent you may have had in your heart. And I've come to this conclusion: be wise in what you say when you say it. So Job comes directly to God, and out of the silence God answers him. And God asks him 64 questions back to back, which was the last thing Job wanted. He wanted answers. And God says, all right, I'll talk to you now like a man. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Were you there when all of the boundaries were set? And on and on and on, a series of questions on the intricacy and the fine-tuning and the majesty of this world. Something like the psalmist said, when I look at the heavens and the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, what is there in man that you keep him in mind? The whole fascinating world around us. Job, do you really understand all of that? Since you're telling me you will only accept that which you can totally comprehend, let me give you a little test right from the beginning. Tell me how you comprehend this world around you. Do you understand the intricacies of all this? God is opening him up within his own assumptions. When you question a questioner, you determine the entry point of the discussion and you open up the questioner within their own assumptions. That's exactly what God's doing here. Do you really only take all of that which you truly understand? You know, this whole revelation is for God to reveal to Job that he is the creator and the designer. He is the creator and the designer. Now, I understand that in our sophistication with a scientific single vision that we want to give to this world, those are two concepts that are not very popular in the scientific world. Even scientists like Vikramasinghe and Hoyle, when they wrote their book, Evolution from Space, what did they say? Vikramasinghe from Sri Lanka is a Buddhist, which is a non-theistic religion. Sir Frederick Hoyle was a skeptic, an astronomer. Brilliant minds, brilliant minds. They go on to say the mathematical impossibility of just the protein formation is so astronomical that Hoyle says it boils down, and Vikramasinghe, a mathematician, says it is so preposterous given the time to think that all this can come together just in the protein formation, that he would consider it impossible to explain evolution in an earth-bound theory. He's not dispensing with evolution. That's not what he's saying. He said in an earth-bound theory, there has to be something transcendent from here. That's when he posited the panspermian theory, that spores from another planet were brought to seed the earth. Hoyle didn't want to buy that at that time, but Hoyle also accepted it. Francis Crick has accepted it, that spores from another planet. This is the Nobel laureate. He says maybe in a spaceship or whatever. I don't even want to go in that direction. I just want to say to you, we make a mistake when we misposition the idea of evolution as if evolution is pitting itself against creation. It may, and it may not. Evolution to me is a theory of processes. I'm now talking about beginnings. Beginnings. My professor of quantum, John Polkinghorne, at Cambridge University, the dean of Queen's College, Cambridge. Polkinghorne's a latecomer to Christ. In his book, One World, he talks about all the precision required and the contingencies for the early picoseconds of the universe. Here's what he says with just one of them. He said, if you take the expansion and contraction rate, this is one of the issues that Hawking wrestles with too. But if you take the early picoseconds of the expansion and contraction rate of the universe, he says the exactitude demanded was so perfect and the margin of error so small that one slight number off and the universe would have collapsed. He said the exactitude demanded would be like taking aim at a 1 square inch object at the other end of the known universe 20 billion light years away and hit